Right. Hi, everyone. My name is Kylie, and thanks for joining our Legal Live today. I've been told today that I don't have to go through the corporate slides, so I can go straight in, and that's what I'm going to do today to jump straight into the subject matter. But first of all, I've just a very quick introduction about myself and why I'm here. So I've been a lawyer since 1999. I'm dually qualified in Malaysia as well as here in England. I am a non-contentious general corporate and commercial lawyer, if that means anything to anyone. But I like to poke fun at that by saying that I put words on pieces of paper. Essentially, I write contracts for a living, I write policies for a living, and that sort of stuff. I have an executive MBA from the University of Sheffield. I got that just a few years ago during lockdown. I've also got a couple of courses under my belt, one of which is most pertinent here is an AI course at the MIT Professional Education. And one of the reasons why I did that is because I am also a chief product officer of a technology startup, and we got really frustrated at the lack of just lack of information regarding AI and how it would work. And also we found that a lot of tech developers couldn't really explain to us what AI was all about, especially in terms of generative AI. So I usually I get asked to describe myself in 3 words, and usually I use this: I'm a Swiss Army knife. I can do most things pretty well, and when you need a Swiss Army knife, having one is invaluable. But anyway, I digress. So let's begin with AI and what that is. So I'll start with this, and I find it quite interesting. How should we respond to AI today? And this is a quote from The Salmon of Doubt, written by Douglas Adams, and I just think that it's a fabulous quote here. Anything that's in the world that when you're born is normal and ordinary and is just a natural part of the way the world works. Anything that's invented between when you're 15 and 35 is new and exciting, revolutionary, and you can probably get a career in it. And anything invented after you're 35 is against the natural order of things. And I think when AI first burst into our consciousness in the early part of this decade, it was sort of, what is this? What is this magic that we see in front of me? And what is it going to do? Is it going to take over the world? And to some extent, these questions are still being asked today. And really, the impact of this has got to do with how we make decisions, because currently, as everyone knows, all our decisions today that we make today impact the future. You're thinking about what you're wanting to do today that impacts the future. So if you're thinking about, do I make this investment today in that particular part of your business? Do I enter into this contract? Do I purchase this particular asset into my business? Things like that. Those decisions are made today, which impact the future of your business or future of your life to some extent. And the way we make decisions is based on a number of things. It's based on our knowledge, it's based on our experience, it's based on the facts, and it's based on our gut. How do we feel about it? And sometimes it's very difficult to explain that gut feeling. But more often than not, this is now changed into knowledge, experience, facts, and data. What does the data say? What does the data say in relation to your business? What does the data say in relation to what you're trying to do and how that works and stuff like that? The problem is that data now is voluminous. There are loads and loads of data out there that you can obtain. You can find all kinds of data in relation to any particular subject that you want. You simply have to Google it. If you wanted to know the trade imbalance between the UK and other countries, you can do that. You can find out data and then extrapolate from that. And so it's become really, really difficult to make decisions because you cannot know everything. And so how are you going to make decisions? So let's start with the basic. What is artificial intelligence? Well, firstly, I'm just going to say to you, it's not intelligent and it's not magic. It doesn't do any of those two things. It's all about machine learning, neural networks, chain of thought, decision trees, random forests, regressions, correlation matrices, data sets, etc. It is a lot of data. It is using that data in a way that creates something of value. At the end of it, in my simplistic mind, it is all about maths. It's all about statistics. So why AI now? Why has it burst into our consciousness now? Well, there's two things, a combination of two things. The development of statistics and statistical analysis, that's been growing in the years, and there is now an abundance of data. There's a lot of data out there in data centers, even within your own organization. There is an abundance of data. There's years and years and years of the World Wide Web, and documents that are generated, websites that are generated in those last 20, 25 years of the internet being around. There are currently 149, there was 149 zettabytes created and captured and consumed in 2024. This year, it is predicted to be 181 zettabytes. Now, a zettabyte is 10 to the power of 21. So 10 with 21 zeros behind that. So it's bigger than a trillion, much, much bigger than a trillion. And that's how much data we are actually creating as a result of all the stuff that we do that is reliant on the internet. If you're interested, a zettabyte can actually store up to 250 billion DVDs. So that's a lot of DVDs in terms of one zettabyte. And the next one up is actually a yottabyte, 10 to the power 24. That means 10 with 24 zeros behind it. And not only is there data in abundance, and there is also the development of statistical analysis, is also the increasing computing power. So that's why NVIDIA is one of the largest companies in the world right now, because its chips are being used specifically for the computational power required to power and to analyze data for AI. Now, there are two different things when it comes to AI. There is what I would call the normal AI using data and crunching, number crunching essentially. And then there's generative AI, which is all about creating text or understanding text. And if you ever want to know where it all started with this paper, Attention is All You Need by Vaswani in 2017. They were essentially Google engineers who were working in Google Translate, and they were trying to translate words from one language into another. And because people don't translate just words, they translate full sentences, there was a need for there to be a system in which they could understand that sentence, the system could understand the sentence, so that it could translate that into the second language that also provides the context and the understanding of the first, the original language. So it wasn't just translating it word for word, but it was also translating the meaning behind those words. And essentially, this is the creation, the starting point, if you like, for generative AI. Generative AIs are powered by what is known as large language models. So if you hear large language models or LLMs, this is what it is. It's essentially a system, a large language model that understands language and then provides a response. And one of the main components of a large language model is the GPT. It's a generative pre-trained transformer. That is the bit that converts the numbers into text. So ChatGPT stands for Chat Generative Pre-trained Transformer. So now you know what ChatGPT actually means. So they are designed essentially to understand human queries, so they understand natural language and to provide coherent answers. We know that if any of you have messed with any large language model, whether it's ChatGPT or anything else, Gemini, whatever, you know if you ask it a question, it will provide you a coherent answer. Those responses, however, are based on probabilities. And that's why when it generates a text, you see one word followed by another, followed by another, followed by another. Now, a few years ago, that text could take very, very long to generate. Now it's really, really quick. It's almost like someone is speed typing. But what essentially is happening is that the GPT is essentially predicting the first word and then predicting the next probable second word, the next probable third word, the next probable fourth word. It does not inherently understand your question, nor does it inherently understand the response. What it's doing is only using probability to try and understand your question in order to provide a response based on probability only. So it doesn't understand anything about what you ask it. Now, in order to generate that sort of level of responses, you need to have lots and lots of data. And so in OpenAI's LLM, it is rumored that they have 1.8 trillion parameters. What that means, 1.8 trillion digits or data points in order for them to figure out your question, first of all, and then the answer to that prompt. Okay, now if you forget anything I say today, remember this point. Don't ask a question of an LLM unless you know the answer to it. Because this is the worrying thing, because it still hallucinates, although the probability of it doing that is now reduced, but it still does. So if you ask it a question about something that you don't understand, you cannot verify the answer to your question because it's not telling you the truth. It's telling you what's probable rather than the truth, rather than the fact. So if you use LLM as a search engine, beware, it's not actually searching, it's actually giving you an answer based on probability only. Now, AI has been around for quite some time. It's not new, it's not novel, and it shouldn't scare anyone. It's been used for weather forecasting for years, and they use it in supercomputers to generate models to predict what's actually happening to the weather. It's used in lane and drive assist that you may have in new cars. Automated driving is another one of them. It's also very good at identifying certain shapes and sizes, and therefore it's good for identifying cancers. Skin cancers is one of the use cases that we use for AI. In terms of recognizing shapes and sizes, I've got another example right at the end, which I will show you as well. Obviously, online translation, that's another good use. It's first started with that. It's also in the recommendation systems that you see in Netflix and video on demand platforms. And what's happening is that Netflix, for example, is trying to predict what you might wish to watch next based on what you've watched before and based on a sample group of people who have watched similar things to you. So if you've watched ABC, then they're trying to think, well, if there is a sample group of people who've watched the same films, A, B, and C, what are they most likely to watch next? And they will suggest that as a recommended film or series for you to watch next. And also in terms of ChatGPT making really bad jokes, why don't tell jokes? Because they might crack up. Now, here's the thing about this. The joke is an illustration, because if you were to train a large language model only on bad dad jokes, all it would do every day long is give you really bad dad jokes. So the training that's given to a large language model, to some extent, gives the result, in terms of what the expected results are. If you give it bad data, it will produce bad responses. And that's another fundamental point that you need to understand in relation to AI. Now, okay, so hopefully I've given you a bit of a grounding in terms of what AI is. It's not magic. It's all to do with data. It's all to do about how that data is processed, how that data is dealt with. Now we jump into the main course, if you like, the legal considerations. So if you're thinking of using AI, and it could be generative AI, it could just be general AI in terms of number crunching. What do you need to start thinking about? What do you need to bear in mind as you start to do that? Well, there are a few things, unfortunately. So the first thing to look at is whether or not personal data is being used in that system, and if so, how do you deal with it in terms of the UK GDPR and data protection laws? Because using an AI system to look at personal data is essentially processing of personal data. And if there is processing, then the question is, who is the processor, who is the data controller, and such like. And so we have to understand who is actually doing the data processing. Is it going to be you, the business, or is it going to be a third party that's doing the AI work for you? Is this going to be done within your own systems or externally in someone else's systems, in your provider's system? And does that system sit within the UK? And even if it's set within the UK, do other developers from outside the UK have access to that data? So this is one of those issues which people who deal with data protection tear their hair out all the time. So I'll give you an example. I have a client who wanted to get a provider to carry out some work. Some of that work would include personal data, but whilst the company was based in the UK, they had developers based in India. So the question for us was, is there any processing that happens outside the UK? And the answer is yes, because there were developers based outside the UK who were accessing the UK data center in order to access that personal data. Then we had to ensure that that particular access was covered under some kind of legal governance. And so we had to deal with that as a separate piece to not just, you're doing work for us. So understanding the complexities around how personal data is going to be accessed and looked at and processed, and whether it's going to be done only within the UK or external to the UK is really, really important. So you understand that. Then there's also the risk of data breaches. Who is going to have the responsibility for dealing with that? How secure is the cybersecurity measures in order to mitigate data leaks or hacks? Now, we've seen some of that happening recently with M&S and with Jaguar Land Rover. Now, some of it relate to data breaches, some of it might not. But the issues remain the same in the sense that, cybersecurity is a serious issue and it has to be dealt with so that you can deal with those issues or you can prevent them from happening, and also ensuring that the appropriate people have responsibility for dealing with it when it does happen. The other element here is about automated decision making, and I think there's a temptation to use AI to come up with a decision. And speaking to some people who use AI, I've been told that in certain organizations, the use of AI has been useful to try and palm off difficult decisions, essentially saying, well, because it's so difficult, we'll let AI decide the point, and no one takes responsibility for it. But I can say to you that that's not the best way of doing it, because literally, if you're making decision making using AI that affects someone and has a legal effect on a person, UK GDPR prohibits you from doing that. So a good example of this is like for automated systems for timekeeping and absence monitoring in an organization. They may have AI involved in tracking that, and if there is a decision that has to be made to suspend a person because of their attendance, that decision has to be taken by a person rather than the system automatically suspending them just because they've reached a certain level. So if you are dealing with any of this, then perhaps it's worth having a conversation around, how do we make sure that these systems work? And the answer to that is usually, well, make sure that there's a person in the loop, a human in the loop, to make that final decision on whether or not to suspend or to take any further disciplinary action. Right. there's a whole load around intellectual property and AI generated content as well. So some of you will know that there is litigation happening in the US in relation to this as well. There are rights owners who are suing large language models for the usage of their protected works in developing their large language models. Now, in the UK, what we have is we don't have a specific act that deals with AI, so we've got to use the Copyright and Design and Patents Act of 1988. So this was written in 1988, guys, before AI was, in probably not in the imagination at all. But here's the thing: one of the things that happens in AI is what is known as text and data analysis, or what I like to call as text and data mining. Whenever you prompt an AI system, whether it's ChatGPT or whatever, you use text. That text is converted into numbers because the machine, the computer, doesn't understand text. It only understands numbers. And when it does that, what it does is it converts your text into data. And that data is then analyzed and analysis. Similarly, when you upload a document into a large language model like a ChatGPT, you upload a PDF or a Word document or whatever it may be into a large language model, what it's doing is converting that text into numbers so that it can understand it. And that is text and data mining. Likewise, if you are creating a large language model and you need to train your model, you are essentially doing text and data analysis. Now, here's the thing. In Section 29A, it's text and data mining is not permitted in the UK for commercial purposes. So that leads us into an issue. What is a commercial purpose? Well, unfortunately, the Act doesn't define commercial purpose. So but the understanding here is that if you're using it in the context of education, in terms of your own personal use, in terms of in an educational setting, universities perhaps, then it's perfectly fine. But if you do it within the context of a business, then it is not permitted. Okay. Now, this is in relation to documents that do not belong to you. You don't own the copyright. If it's your own document, text and data mine away. Text and data analyze away. It's your own document. You have all the rights to it. But if it's someone else's, then there's an issue because you need to have permission from that rights holder to analyze that text, to data mine that text. The next question is, are you being mined? So if you are generating documents, if you are generating a lot of content and you're sending that out, are your works now being looked at and being mined and being used for text and data analysis? So that's a question. And I recently had a client who had that particular issue and said to me, well, this is of a concern to us. What do we do about it? So we had to put various terms into our contracts now to stop our counterparties from actually looking at our text and data, our content, for the purposes of analysis on AI systems, because we don't know how much of that data is used to train a large language model and how much of that will be retained by that model once it's used. Third point, ownership of AI created works. There is still a great unknown there about ownership of AI created works, because in the Copyright Design and Patents Act of 1988, it does say that any computer generated work would be owned by the person who put the systems together that created the outcome, the computer generated work. But remember, this was written up in 1988. And in 1988, the closest we ever got to a computer generated software was probably Microsoft Paint. Where we would draw a circle on Word and sorry on Microsoft Paint, we would fill it with color. We can choose what color and what shade it was. But nowadays, you can create a whole logo or a whole paragraph, if not a whole page of text, just by a single prompt. To what extent do you have agency in relation to that? And I think that is the difficulty that currently content creators and also lawyers have an issue with, in the sense that, yes, it says computer generated work, but to what extent does the user have to have agency in creating that work before that work belongs to the author, the person creating it? And the question is, if it's created by AI, does it even allow protection of copyright or any other IP protection? Now, just to answer that particular point, firstly, in the States, the American courts have found that if you create a document or an image purely on AI, purely using AI, that is currently not protected under US copyright law. Because under US copyright law, it has to be a person. The person has to do it. And merely prompting is not sufficient. In the UK, we still have no clarity in this. But I would say to you, be very careful if you're using AI to generate content. Be very careful, be very aware about what you're doing. Be very aware if you're using that for external party work. Okay, now, the use of third-party data and IP, I've talked about this. AI models are currently being sued in America about incorporating copyrighted or proprietary data without permission. So there is going to, I think there's going to be a long tail in relation to this, in the sense that how long will that liability run, and to what extent are you as the end user going to be brought in as potentially someone who may have innocently used it to generate content, and now that work cannot be used anymore. So just be aware that that is something that is still being decided in America, and not yet even started here in the UK. Then about patentability of AI innovations. I'm sure some of you may have read that AIs have created patents and all that sort of stuff. Now, again, in the States, that is not allowed. In South Africa, they are a bit of a trailblazer there. In South Africa, they have accepted a patent that's generated directly by AI. Now, I reckon that in the UK, that it would not be accepted if it's generated purely by AI. I think there needs to be an author, a person, an inventor for a patent. Right. There are also AI risk considerations. I think I've talked about it as well. What is the chain of liability for an AI model? If you use an AI model, who is liable if the AI model creates something which may appear to be correct on the face of it, but is incorrect at the end of it? So there needs to be clarity from your perspective, especially if you're generating that for a customer. So there are two issues here. One is your liability to your customer, and the second is your IT provider or the large language model's liability to you. So how do you marry that up, and how do you deal with that from a contractual governance perspective? Secondly, there is also a need to maintain regular audits of AI models, because AI models are inherently biased, and there is also potentially a risk of discrimination there. And I will show you an illustration of this later on. Back in the early 2020s, I say early 2020s, we're just in the mid, but a few years ago, if you would go to an AI model and you just type in create an image of a baby for me, there would tend to be white Caucasian babies. Now, nothing wrong with that, but obviously, because the model's been trained specifically in relation to that, that's what it generates. Now, in circumstances where you're dealing with lots of data, if your data is inherently biased, for example, if you only do business with a particular subset of society, then your data will always be biased towards that. And if you start relying on those models, then in effect, it could be creating discriminatory risks if you rely on those models specifically for certain outcomes. So remember to look at this. Most data scientists would be very, very aware of this, and they should be advising you if any of your data that you have is biased to a certain segment or is discriminatory against another segment. AI in contracts and consumer protection. So that again, using AI in contract management and stuff like that, you need to be very careful as well. This is currently being used in terms of lending and insurance as well. Again, it's about compliance with GDPR and making sure that there are no bias and discrimination risks involved in terms of contract management. Mitigating risks. So one of the issues in relation to using AI is, well, how far should we use it? How do we mitigate the risks? And I think one of the things that I've been very keen to shout about is remember that at the end of the day, you still control how your staff or how your organization uses AI. And therefore, it's important to set out what is the policy. Do we allow our staff to generate content from scratch, or are we allowing them only to use it for polishing stuff that they've already done? And things like this have an impact also upon the working day, because if someone can generate a document just by making 5 prompts, what is going to spend the rest of their day doing, and why are we paying them? So these are issues which you have to deal with and you have to think about in terms of how do you use it within your organization. And I think you have clear human oversight, making sure that if there's any AI generated content, there's always a human person that reviews it and confirms that that's correct, or approves it. And that person needs to be responsible for that particular piece of work. Now, if you are still in the early stages of thinking about, well, how do we do AI? How do we engage with someone in an organization? Most of us are going to be contracting that work out. So it's important that you have very, very clear guidelines on what are the deliverables that you want from the AI developer. Who owns the models? Because at the end of the day, there is a large language model that sits in the background, and usually the developer is developing an algorithm that sits on top of it specifically for you. So the question is, who owns that model? Who owns that algorithm that sits on top of the large language model? Is it going to be you, or is it going to be licensed to you only? So having clarity of that is important, because it also ensures that, well, if it's owned by you, then who's going to maintain it? Is there going to be a cost of maintenance? If it's owned by the developer and licensed to you, then what are the terms of that licensing involved? Maintenance, I've touched on that, because every time you feed data into your AI model, and you change your outcomes. So if you're trying to determine whether or not you use a particular space in your warehouse, and whether this warehouse is being properly utilized, and you use AI to help you manage that, just by managing that, you've now changed the outcomes, and you now have a new set of data to look at. And now that new set of data has to be used to train your model so that you can get better at predicting what you need next. And so an AI model is not a one and done. It's actually one and again and again and again, because those AI models should and can be improved, which leads me to improvements. So who is going to be responsible for improving those models over time? Is it going to be your developer? Is it going to be you? So having clarity on that is important. I think a lot of people think, oh, well, I've used AI and that's it. It's there, it works, great. But what about the future? What about what comes next? Other considerations that you might want to think about, and those of you who use AI in services, well, will it now reduce your perceived value because you're using AI? Because something that might take you, 3 hours will now take you 3 minutes to generate. So will it devalue the value of your work? There's also the commoditization risk of AI. If you are using AI, how are you now able to justify your premium pricing if that's what you're doing? In terms of the use of AI, I think customers are maybe skeptical in terms of using AI models in terms of generating work for them, because there's a fear of bias, errors, and such like. So how do you position AI in terms of what it does? A lot of people now go and shout about the fact that, yeah, we're using AI in our organization. Well, that's great, because when I receive their contracts, I will go, well, it doesn't address AI in your contract. So what are you saying the AI is being used for? And if it's used for this, then why are you charging us for that? Because presumably it'll take you 5 minutes to generate it. So, and then finally, human in the loop. I know I've said this about 3 times already. Position AI as an enhancement rather than a replacement. If you do that, and your customers see value in that oversight and expertise, they're more willing to take on board the use of AI in the services and the work that you do for them. So these are sort of the general considerations, and really there's more to it than that, but they can get very, very specific. So if you think of anything else, by all means, raise any questions that you've got in the Q and in the questions down below. Now, I'm just going to wrap up, and I'm going to wrap up with 2 examples of AI at work, and hopefully this will give you a bit to think about. So firstly, I put this image into, I think it was ChatGPT I used. So this is a picture of me. I put it into ChatGPT and I said, generate an image of using this image as an example. And the first image it generated was this. And immediately you're thinking, well, hang on a second, that looks nothing like Kiley. And you'll be right. It looks absolutely nothing like me. In fact, it's a million miles away from me. And I said, well, so I went back in and I went, no, that's not the image I want. I am Asian, by the way. And then it generated this third image. And this is the problem with AI. None of these pictures, none of those 2 generated pictures are me, but they are an approximation of what it thinks is me. Okay, and this is the thing that you need to notice. First of all, you'll notice that it's got my glasses. So all 2 generated images have glasses. It's also interesting to note that they've caught the highlights or the gray hair actually in my hair, in my hair. They've caught it. They've reproduced that. They've reproduced the parting of my hair. They've even reproduced the checks on my shirt. Okay. Now, I don't know why it thinks that I have a 5 o'clock shadow. I obviously don't in that picture, but it generated that. But you can see now it's an approximation. It is a close probability that it is generating. It is not the truth. Because what it should do is to generate a very, very close, similar representation of that picture, but it didn't. Now, maybe newer models now would be able to do that, and I'm sure it will do, okay? But at the end of the day, realize the limitations of generative AI. The next one is an example of how AI is used in a very simplistic but really important role. Now, I traveled in Southeast Asia in the summer of this year. And if you've ever been to Singapore and Malaysia, people there go crazy over buns, over bread type foods. Okay, and there's loads of bakeries around that sell baked goods. It's buns of all kinds with all kinds of fillings in them. You could walk into a shop, into a bakery, and they could have 20, 30 kinds of buns that are on sale. Now, these are self-serve shops. You go in, you have a tray, you grab your own tongs, and then you grab the buns into your tray, and you take it to the counter and you pay. The thing is, there are about 20, 30 products in the store, and they are at different price points. Never are the 2 buns ever the same price. And usually the queues are about 20 to 30 people long. And you can see here, there's about 2 counters. I think there were 3 counters on operating on the day. Now, what I realized was that when in this particular store, when you took the buns there, the cashier, what he would do was to make sure that the buns didn't overlap on the tray. So what he would do, he would spread out the buns in the tray. And if you notice where I've circled red, there is a downward looking camera. And that downward looking camera is essentially critical because all it's doing is recognizing the shapes of the buns on the tray. Remember, the cashier is trying not to overlap, so it's laying them flat, and then the camera does all the work. So the camera takes an image, and on the point of sale, it generates the bun and the price on a screen that I can see as the customer. And that takes seconds to do. Now, if you didn't have that system, the cashier would, first of all, need to be trained in the 20, 30 odd buns there are so that he can recognize them. I mean, he doesn't need to know the price, but all he needs to do is the type of buns, and he could just key them in. There would be potential errors for sure, because they might misrecognize certain buns and they would overcharge customers, or worse, undercharge a customer. And so all these are issues. And the second thing is about time. If you've ever been to Southeast Asia, people are not very patient in that part of the world, and people don't like queuing. And so waiting is not something that's on the agenda. So it needs to move fast. It needs to move quickly. And by having the system in place, what they were able to do was they were able to get those customers moving quickly, getting paid for the buns, and then moving on to the next customer. It was simple, it was straightforward, but it was impactful. And I think this is one of the best examples I can find of AI. It doesn't have to be, wow, we're managing the whole business using AI. This is one very specific use case within the organization, and it was wonderful to see. So with that, hopefully I've given you some food for thought. And I'm sorry, it's about, oh, sorry, it's 1:45 now. So can I pass the time back to Louise?